All right, everyone, welcome to our next lesson. This lesson is going to talk about the war in the Pacific. So we have our objectives and standards here. Analyze the strategy used by the Japanese in the Pacific and explain the significance of key battles in the region. If you would take a look at the standards too. So think about this. Do you know what happened on do you know what happened at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941? I'm sure some of you may know this, some of you may not. So just let me know if you do or not. Okay, so our essential question, what occurred in the fighting in the Pacific during the war? Okay, so the U.S. had already cracked the Japanese secret code by October 1940 and knew their plans for Southeast Asia. Japan is obviously expanding in the Pacific at this time, and the United States knows that if the Japanese took control of European colonies in the region, it could also be a threat to American interest and colonies in the area as well. So to kind of prevent this a little bit, the U.S. government aided China in their resistance against the Japanese. And when Japan invaded French Indochina, which was Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, in July 1941, Roosevelt cut off oil shipments to them. So the Japanese obviously kind of upset about this whole oil embargo and things like that. And other things the United States is doing, they decide to launch massive attacks against European colonies, the United States outposts in the Pacific prior to that. And then Admiral Izuki Yamamoto of Japan, there's a picture of him there, called for an attack on the U.S. and Hawaii because the U.S. had a large naval fleet at the Pearl Harbor base. So in the morning hours of December 7th, 1941, naval forces for the U.S. were attacked at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The United States had known an attack was probably coming from Japan. They just didn't know specifically where it was going to happen. They didn't think it was going to happen at Pearl Harbor. They thought it was going to happen at a couple of different locations. So again, they just weren't really sure where it was going to come. The attack damaged 19 ships, including 8 battleships and also many, many aircraft of the United States. And it resulted in the death of 2,300 Americans, and 1,100 were also wounded. So again, a very key event in American history that will bring the United States into World War II. So here's some pictures from Pearl Harbor. You can see the ships on fire there. And they actually have a memorial in Pearl Harbor now, Hawaii, which is the USS Arizona, which is one of the ships that was sunk, that you can go visit. And the remains of those sailors and Americans are still on board the ship, but they have a memorial there to the victims of Pearl Harbor. So the attack shocked and saddened the American people. President Roosevelt made a speech to Congress the next day and asked that war be declared between Japan and the United States. Congress does accept that, and they declare war on Japan and its allies. And a few days after that, Germany will then turn and declare war on the U.S. shortly after that. So at this point, the United States is officially involved in World War II. So some more victories for Japan. Japan easily conquered the islands of Guam and Wake Island following Pearl Harbor. They next focused their attention on the Philippines. So in January 1942, Japanese forces marched into the capital city Manila, and American and Filipino forces fought hard for 3 months on the Bataan Peninsula. Unfortunately, in April 1942, Japan was able to capture the prisoners and the area. And then the Allied prisoners were then forced to march more than 50 miles up the peninsula in what would become known as the Bataan Death March. And the world, begins to learn kind of about the treatment of prisoners of war by the Japanese. Japan believed that surrendering was a sign of weakness, so they really mistreated prisoners of war. Many of these prisoners of war were executed. Many more died along the way from, things from dehydration, hunger, sickness, illness, whatever, wounds. So again, this is just something that Japan, and even in the prisoner of war camps, prisoners were not treated very well. So just something to remember as we go through World War II. Here's a picture of the Bataan Death March. You can see the Allies prisoners of war there with their hands up and being marched, and you have the Japanese soldiers on the side. So you can see it was many prisoners of war taken, and many of them will not survive the Bataan Death March. So, although Japan appeared undefeatable, the Allies were determined to fight back. And in April 1942, 16 B-52 American bombers, under the command of James Doolittle, bombed Tokyo and other Japanese cities. So the attack boosted the spirits of Americans and shocked the Japanese because, again, the Japanese thought they were invincible up until that point and didn't believe that an attack would come on their homeland. So it did prove that Japan was not invincible, and it just gives the Americans a little bit of hope since many of the battles that have been going on were not so successful. Turning the tide. So Japanese forces were headed for New Guinea, where they could launch an attack against the country of Australia. Um, the Battle of the Coral Sea, which occurs around this area, was unique in the fact that it was completely naval warfare with airplanes from both sides fighting. Now, the Allies did lose more troops and ships, but they were able to stop Japan's advances towards Australia. Also, after Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto decides to focus on the island of Midway, where an essential American airfield was located, but the U.S. had already decoded a message about the attack and knew where it was coming, so they were prepared. So on June 4th, 1942, American forces waited for the Japanese attack at Midway, and as the first Japanese planes took off, the U.S. launched their attack and surprised the Japanese forces. Many of the Japanese planes weren't even off the aircraft carriers yet, or weren't even able to take off into the sky as the U.S. kind of launched this counterattack, you could call it. So the Battle of Midway was a success for the U.S. Because it resulted in the destruction of 332 Japanese aircraft, 4 aircraft carriers, and a Japanese support ship. So the Japanese naval forces are really kind of destroyed, and Yamamoto was forced to withdraw his forces as the battle came to an end on June 7th, 1942, so about 3 days later. After the victory at Midway, again boosting American and Allied spirits and morale, they decided to go on the offensive. So General Douglas MacArthur came up with a plan to defeat the Japanese, and he calls his plan island hopping. Now, island hopping is instead of focusing on the strongholds of the Japanese, which could cost more lives and supplies, he says, why don't we focus on, or he and his advisors, I should say, let's focus on the weaker spots of the Japanese islands and conquer them to move closer to the island nation. Okay, so then they can move closer to Japan to eventually maybe launch an attack or an invasion to end the war with Japan. The first test of this came at the island of Guadalcanal, where Japan was building a huge air base. U.S. Marines, along with the support from Australian troops, landed on the island on August 7, 1942. Now, the Allied forces were successful at first, but the fight would become very deadly, and both sides will dig in, and the fight will last until February 1943. And eventually, the Japanese will withdraw due to a large loss of life. All right, so wrap up here. So war comes to the U.S. That picture there is the picture of President Roosevelt giving the speech to Congress about declaring war on Japan after Pearl Harbor. So Pearl Harbor was attacked by Japan, and the U.S. will declare war on Japan and its allies. Japan did have continued success in the Pacific, as we talked about, and the Bataan Death March showed the treatment of prisoners of war by the Japanese. That map there, I'm sorry, I got a little cut off there, but it kind of shows you the march, the Bataan Death March a little bit. And then finally, the Allies will begin to have success. The Allies began to have success against Japan, especially with the Battle of Midway and the Battle of Guadalcanal. And these key battles will begin to turn the tide of the war in the Pacific against the Japanese. All right, so that's all I have for today for this lesson. So again, you'll get extra credit for completing this lesson and submitting the answers, and I'll see you and talk to you soon.